Hello and welcome to season 5 of the Unmute Now podcast. My name is Natasha, and with me co-hosting today is the lovely Yolande Robertson Green.
Hi, everybody.
Unfortunately, today it will just be Yolande and I holding down the fort. Angela had some parental duties, and Raquel is sitting out this season, but she's very much present in the background. So, on to today's episode. We are joined by Esther Stanford Xosei. Now, Esther is a Motherist, a Jurisconsult, Decolonial Reparationist, and community advocate, specializing in the critical legal praxis of law as resistance. Esther uses this approach to social movement, lawyering, Mother Earth jurisprudence, and eco-socio-legal transformation from the grassroots. What a mouthful, right? Welcome to Unmute Now, Esther, where we seek to raise the volume on the whispered conversations in our communities. Welcome, Esther.
Greetings.
Hi,
Greetings.
Esther.
Now, I know that introduction was a mouthful there, Esther, but I'm sure the audience, our listening and viewing audience, would love to hear a bit about yourself. So can you just tell us a little bit of what it is that you do?
So essentially, my work entails advocacy. So I'm an advocate, otherwise known as a jurisconsult, which is a specialist lawyer that specializes in jurisprudence, which is actually the science and the philosophy of law. So I'm really interested in what are the value systems that guide legal decision making, and in particular, what is the role of ordinary people in actually transforming law, as opposed to just seeing law as something that is given to us from on high, from people above. So that's my work, and my work around advocacy is particularly directed to the movement for repair or reparations. Some people use the term reparatory justice. So I do a lot of campaigning, advocacy, and in truth, educational work, explaining to different sections of society the meaning of reparations, because it's one of the most misunderstood terms.
Esther, I'm interested in the picture you have in the background. I love it. Sorry for those of you who are listening, you can't see what I'm seeing, but I love that picture. And just below your name, Esther, you have as your descriptor, I suppose this is something you raise in the volume on. You've got Stop the Maangamizi campaign. I hope I've said that right. Can you tell us a bit about that and perhaps what's the picture in the background?
Sure. So the Stop the Maangamizi campaign is a campaign that I coordinate. I'm the coordinator general of, and co-founded the campaign in 2015, which grew out of the work of a coalition that I also co-founded over 20 years ago, called the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe. And what the Stop the Maangamizi campaign does is actually support the movements towards reparatory justice that are alive today in the world, and in particular those movements emanating from people of African ancestry and heritage, whether we're born in the Caribbean, the wider Americas, Europe, or indeed the continent of Africa. And we have in the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, which operates globally, we have a UK strategy around trying to develop some kind of mechanism where the voices of our people can be heard on reparations. And so that's really our work. It's to mobilize people in defense of our rights to repair, our rights to reparations, and to ensure that those efforts are harnessed so that we can actually engage in transforming our reality today. So that's the Stop the Maangamizi campaign. And as for the imagery behind me, to my left, which I'm not sure how you're seeing it, it's actually a picture of a Maasai warrior, predominantly found in the region of Kenya today. And I have a backdrop that is a very sort of earth centered backdrop with trees, which I felt really represented my own work, which, even though I'm interested and very much concerned and have dedicated my life to the struggle for reparations, that's also connected to my work involved in tackling environmental racism, it's known as socio-eco transformation from below, which is really dealing with questions of how the environment impacts on us.
Esther, how do you get any sleep at all?
Speaking of reparations, Esther, now I know that's something that's been bandied about, for the last few decades or so, but there's still some people who, when they hear the term reparations, they're just thinking about it in the context of paying money to the African diaspora for the damages of the transatlantic slave trade. But today we want to focus on what you've been calling the repair part of reparations. But before we do that, would you care to explain the concept of reparations for our audience that might be unaware, who might have heard the term, but they're not quite, all they're thinking about is just money?
Can I interject just before Esther answer? I have to put my hand up here publicly, which I did back in October at our symposium, that I was one of those people who always ignorantly discarded reparations and the belief that it was just about money. So speaking about our symposium back in October, Esther lovingly, kindly agreed to be one of our presenters. If you haven't watched any of those episodes, they're all on our YouTube channel. And because of that symposium and the nature of the funding we received for that, out of that, we thought that it would have been prudent to have Esther on our podcast so that her message can get out to even more people. Esther, I'm really interested in your response.
Thank you. And yes, you're right. The unpopular consciousness, and I think the mass media has a lot to do with this. Conversations around reparations always seem to start and stop with how much money we want or we're entitled to, and should Britain pay, and questions like that. But actually, if we go to the root of the term reparations, it includes within it repare, which means to repair. And if we go to the Old English definitions of repair, it really talks about repairing something that has been injured. And whatever has been injured, a repair process or initiative should result in the transformation of that thing or people or group. So essentially, one definition that I like of reparations that's very succinct is coming from a coalition in the United States of America called NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, of which I'm a co-chair of their International Affairs Commission. And NCOBRA argues that reparations is a process of the repairing, the healing, and the restoring of a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental rights. And this injury comes from governments, from corporations, from institutions, and in some cases, families. So that is a very short
definition, Esther.
A very short definition. However, going beyond that, I also like to emphasize a framework by somebody called Professor Chinwezu, who is a Nigerian public intellectual, and he advanced a famous definition of reparations that spoke to reparations being about repair. Again, he emphasizes much more deeply the meaning of repair, and he talks about all the different kinds of repair that are necessary in a reparations process. And he actually emphasizes the importance of self-repair, even for a people that have gone through massive group injustices such as enslavement and colonization, that it's not always about what other people have to do to repair, but it's also about what we have to do by way of self-repair. And he talks about economic repairs, educational repairs, social repairs, psychological repairs, repairs in our families, repairs in our group understanding, repairs in the way that we relate to each other, and very importantly, he talks about the repair of the mind, because any type of oppression, especially colonization, actually impacts our group mind, because we have internalized, perhaps in some cases, notions of inferiority, so-called Black inferiority. Others internalize notions of, say, white superiority, and this often lives on in the institutions and the systems that actually govern our lives today. And Chinweizu emphasizes that the most important part of any repair process is our self-repair, the changes that will come about as a result of undertaking a repair process, the changes that will come about in our sense of who we are, our sense of dignity, our sense of pride, and our sense of the ability to do, the capacity to be self-determining. And that is part of the transformation and the restoration. And also there's international law, which many people can't really argue with. And international law recognizes that reparations is much more than money also, and that there are 5 main aspects to reparations, which compensation, which is really what people emphasize as the money bit, that's only one of the other 4, I should say, aspects of a reparations process. But the first part is actually stopping the harm. Yeah, how can there be repair if the harm is continuing? And one of the most everyday harms that we could all possibly relate to are the harms of racism, anti-Black racism, and the specific form that affects people of African descent, which is known as Afrophobia. And so a world without racism against any group, but in particular talking in the context of people of African descent, imagine that. So stopping that harm is the first part to a repair process. And then we have
Can
to
interject. If I
Yes.
may interject, Esther, I can see the link between all that you're talking about and the Stop the Maangamizi campaign in terms of stopping the harm. For me, the definition stands out in my mind. The first definition, it's one that I can buy into. And when you talk about the different types of repair, it brings to my mind a term that I know, well, this was coined by American Dr. Joy DeGruy. I hope I've pronounced her name correctly.
Yes.
Post-traumatic slave disorder.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of research that's been done, building on the work of people like Dr. Joy DeGruy on post-traumatic slave syndrome, but in particular, NCOBRA, that I've already mentioned, has produced a report called the Harm Report, and it looks at what is called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, which really looks at the passing down of trauma through the generations and how that's still impacting on us. Because one of the issues that comes up a lot when discussions happen about reparations, it seems to be presented as though we're just seeking some kind of redress for what happened to ancestors who have all passed, and you're all right now. We didn't do it. You're not harmed. Why are we talking about reparations? So a lot of the research that's been done by our practitioners, our theorists, our scholars, to really shine a light on the continuum of this harm. Yes, it did begin with our foreparents and our ancestors, but actually each generation is having to deal with different manifestations of this harm. It impacts our psyches, it impacts our parenting patterns, it impacts what's happened in our families in terms of family breakdown, family separation, of course, economic disadvantage, that continues to impact our quality of life. And just as with all other people that have gone through group injustice, such as Jewish people, Aboriginal people, Indigenous American people, a lot of that research is now focusing on people of African heritage and ancestry, wherever we are on the planet. recognizing that a lot of what we face and the disproportionate impacts or legacies of enslavement and colonization that we face, how that is linked to this notion of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance that must be taken seriously in terms of
Absolutely.
access to services, the kind of research that needs to be done, the kind of services that are developed as interventions that can better meet our needs.
But speaking of, just to draw a link as well there, Esther, in recent times, we've seen the need for, veterans from the various wars, whether the war in Afghanistan or Iraq and things like that, the need for those ex-soldiers, those veterans to be receiving care for the PTSD that they've been suffering. And some people might think, oh, but that was just recently, or that wasn't that long ago, right? But how much more so people with a legacy of slavery and passing down all that trauma, from such a long time to now and still experiencing things like racism, how much more necessary is that repair work? That kind of need for that care for the trauma that's been passed down, how much more so is that necessary? Now, just so some people don't get it twisted, not because you're saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, not because you're saying that there's a need for, the other form of repair. It doesn't mean that you're saying that there's not an argument for financial compensation, right? Because people might be saying, oh, well, she's talking about this repair, so she's saying, oh, she might mean that, oh, they don't need the financial compensation. Because even if you're thinking about things like the repair work, therapy, things like that, a financial aspect obviously would need to come into that. Am I right?
Yes, I'm not saying that money is not important. What I'm saying is that money is not the only aspect of what reparations are about. And a lot of what reparationists, that is those who campaign for reparations, articulate in terms of some of the interventions that are required, do require resources to actually deliver them. Even if we're looking at specific interventions, whether it's group therapy, family therapy, addressing this sense of learned helplessness that might live on in particular generations, especially where we can see in families particular patterns of dispossession, say high rates of incarceration amongst particular generations, or any other. Let's look at what's happening with children in schools. You often, if you look at what's going on in families, you can trace patterns. And so these interventions will require resources to develop and to deliver, and to actually get the experts on board from our communities who actually have an understanding of our experience. But we emphasize the fact that we can't just start with money. We have to win the argument. We have to influence hearts and minds across society so that there is a recognition that this isn't just like a handout or a paycheck, that actually this is about how do we invest in people, how do we invest in communities so that we can avert some of the huge costs that are there in a society when we don't pay attention to these issues from the womb to the tomb, in terms of the healthcare costs, what it costs to even house young people in so-called local authority care because there's been family breakdown, the cost of what it means to house a young offender in a young offender institute or even a prison, if we were to actually address some of the structural causes why some people may be more likely to enter a particular life path. We emphasize the other aspects of repair, essentially because even if we were to just be given all the money in the world, if we don't have proper planning, then it's not going to necessarily be reparatory. Yeah, it's not going to address those deep-seated issues. And so part of what we also have to do is rebuild ourselves so that we can be in the driving seat. It's not that somebody's coming to fix us, it doesn't work like that. That's not repair. This is not about charity. This is not about creating more dependencies. It's actually about helping people restore their own agency to make the changes that are required individually, within families, within communities and, of course, across society. But there is a big need for it. And as I said, this is not a conversation that's unique to us. Often the media distorts the narrative as though it is, but reparations is something that all groups are actually engaging with in some way, shape, or form. And we can't get distracted by notions either that, well, what about us, or why you and not us? You know, it's for every group to really advocate their own cause and to uncover the deep-seated issues that actually links into why they experience particular types of discrimination and, you know, lack in their lives today.
So Esther, going back to the concept of resources, and in my mind, I'm speaking money now again, back to money. Um, and I'm echoing the sentiments of perhaps a lot of people within the diaspora, or again, well, maybe people outside of the Western Black community who talk a lot about the corrupt governments that we have, you know, in some parts like my own country. Lord help me. And so when we begin to look at money and resources, so to speak, give us specific examples or maybe just one or two things of how you think that the Black community in these parts can best be served by reparation.
You know, that's a really great question, because again, there's always a jump to, okay, let's pay governments. Let's pay governments in Africa, in the Caribbean, where affected communities living with these legacies today originate from. And what I would emphasize is that in international law, reparations are a right of what's known as victims. Victims is not a nice word to think of oneself as, but it really means, how does law recognize that you've been injured and therefore something should be done to stop that injury and repair those harms? It's not about governments, because the governments of the Caribbean in themselves did not experience chattel slavery and colonization. They have inherited these kind of colonial frameworks that they have continued for whatever reason, in terms of there not being full decolonization in the Caribbean, for instance, or in Africa. So reparations, therefore, as a whole range of remedies, including compensation, and what's known as restitution, which is really to give back resources that have been stolen from a people. That's all their material resources, their cultural resources, their spiritual resources, and also their labor, their stolen labor, in terms of being workers who were never paid for that work. And therefore, not only were they as individuals, but their families and therefore their communities and their lineages have been deprived of that wealth that they couldn't pass on through the generations. So there is an approach to repair where we can look at communities, actually resources going into specific communities, from people to people. It's the demands might come in terms of affected communities against governments in, say, the West or Britain, let's say Britain. But in terms of what that looks like and how that gets delivered or implemented, we're really advocating a model of people to people kind of dialogue. So the peoples of the Caribbean, the peoples of Africa and other parts of the world, engaging in dialogue, not just with European governments, but also European people racialized as white, who don't understand these issues, so that they can understand how Britain has and other European countries has and continues to be involved in the extraction of wealth from the regions that people come from, and how that extraction then benefits people in another part of the world. And that would also include some of us, if we're honest, to different degrees. Also taking into consideration our own marginalizations as diaspora groupings, wherever we are in the so-called global north or the west. So resources should be restituted back to the people. not necessarily institutions, not governments, which is what we're seeing now with Caribbean governments engaging in sort of reparations agreements with British universities, where those resources are going to the University of the West Indies, which is still a colonial institution. Okay, and at one time, until a couple of years ago, Queen Elizabeth II was still the head of what's known as the visitor of the University of the West Indies. So what you're having are institutions that were set up by colonizers that actually are not fair to our people in terms of the social classes that get to go to university, even in the Caribbean, what it costs to send a child to university. A lot of the time that's still reinforcing forms of elitism. Yes. And so what we're trying not to do is to continue that system. We have to have wide scale social transformation, and resources must go back into the hands of the communities from which they have been stolen from, not institutions that we don't control and that we are still largely alienated from.
Esther, speaking of restitution and to the Caribbean and not putting necessary compensation into the hands of governments and institutions, I'm not sure if you're aware of what happened earlier in this month of February, for those who might be listening to this at another time, about the Trevelyan family. Right, Yolanda, if you're not aware, there was a family. Well,
media. It made the wrongs on media, I suppose, for those who are interested. Yes.
The Trevelyan family's announcement in early February regarding their £100,000 reparation donation to the island of Grenada for the role that their family played in the enslavement on the island. So apparently the £100,000 is being donated to establish a community fund for economic development on the island. I'm not sure who decided that that's what that money was going to be used for. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was the family. And it is said that they're going to formally apologize for, and I quote, the role our ancestors played in enslavement on the island. And just for a brief background, in the 1800s, the family had over 1,000 slaves and 6 different plantations on the island of Grenada. And they got £34,000 back in 1834, after slavery was abolished. And that's thought to be about £300 million today, just for a frame of reference.
3 million.
Sorry, yes, £3 million pounds today, just for frame of reference. So what are your thoughts about that, ladies?
Yeah, well,
Esther, go ahead, Esther. I'm dying to hear your thoughts.
From my perspective, I saw that story doing the rounds, and just to say, where's it coming from? Again, the CARICOM Reparations Commission have been very involved in negotiating this agreement with the Trevelyan family. And here again, I have to emphasize the problematic nature of that, because what we have now are some middlemen, who are part of reparations institutions, who usurp the role of the affected communities themselves, and go to and negotiate with these families and say, okay, this is a figure that we'll accept. But who consulted any of us? Yeah. And if we look at the people in Grenada, we can't just say, oh, it's for those in Grenadian citizens, because the nature of African enslavement and how different African people were trafficked and where one set of people landed which particular Caribbean country means that all of those who were affected really should be consulted. And we've never democratically elected any government or any institution to be the negotiator on our behalf to accept a finite sum of money as some kind of reparations deal. This contravenes the rights of people to reparations. It contravenes international law, and governments themselves must respect and honor international law, including those governments that are making reparations claims, because reparations are a right of victims. This £100,000 fund is a drop in the ocean. If we're just going to focus on money, it's a drop in the ocean Who decided that they wanted a community centre or well, we've been hearing reports about a fund, but also a community centre and a fund for economic development. Who gets to administer this fund? Who gets to choose where resources go and what kind of projects? This is the problem.
Yep. Who approves the projects?
People, you know, and my family who come from in different Caribbean countries now, they've never had a say. They're totally excluded from these conversations. And this is wrong, because if we are going to actually ensure that reparations heals and restore, this cannot be then imposing other forms of elitism that actually deny us voice and deny our right to have a say. The other thing that people need to be aware of is that in Grenada, like in other countries in the Caribbean, they have citizenship by investment schemes. And so if there is an investment or an injection of cash, such as this amount of money, it could, and this is the concern that is coming from people on the ground in Grenada, be an avenue to citizenship, which is actually being sold to the highest bidder and brings up property prices in the region, in the country, for ordinary people who cannot afford to live. And when our people are relying on barrels that come from us in the diaspora to just provide basic resources for them, and they're locked into hospitality industry, service industry still, we can see how inequality
Speak it.
continuing. This is the problem. And
listen, we can do this all day, Esther.
I want to say, talk the things, Esther, talk the things.
There is still a feedback coming, but I hope our audience can hear us. Esther, my mind is a simple mind, and it goes back to two things: corrupt people, corrupt government. And again, it just goes back to one thing. As you say, 100,000 out of what's worth 3 million today is still not enough. But here, we've got to bring it to a wrap, and we're going to ask you one final question, Esther, because you know that our remit is the empowerment of women. We're going to throw you in the deep end and ask you if you think that there is any role women in particular can play in the whole concept of reparations.
Of course, reparations are essentially an issue for women as well. Unfortunately, a lot of the discussion on reparations do not center women. And there was a famous report in the field of what's called transitional justice called What Happened to the Women, and it identifies this as a structural problem across many reparations frameworks and programs, not just what's coming out of the Caribbean or even Africa. And women themselves and women's groups groups who focus on the rights of women are not sufficiently engaged or included or participating in reparation strategies. And so what's recognized is that any reparations framework must also take account of what's called the gendered harms and crimes of so-called groups that have been victimized. And so there are specific experiences that women, girls, and in some cases men and boys face that should somehow find their way in a reparations process, such as rape, sexual slavery, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, looking at historic and contemporary patterns of these issues, forced labor, including gender-specific forced labor. So in some places in the world, women, so-called maids or domestic servants who are more likely to be abused in homes and lack rights to redress. These are some of the issues. Forced abortion, forced sterilization, forced incest, in some countries even forced marriage, reproductive oppression, racial disparity in breast cancer detection, racial disparity in Black maternal deaths. These are all gendered dimensions of repair issues, that there are distinct campaigns happening in our communities. In some cases, there is taking away of children from, say, women who are quote unquote single parent, who might be impoverished, might be deemed to be bad mothers, and the way in which certain women get classified as being more bad than others. And there are some racial and class dimensions to that. Particular forms of torture that are committed against women, and torture directed to specific body parts, such as women's private parts, etc., etc. And so these examples of injustice that affect women, and especially domestic violence, which is one that many women's groups also focus on, there needs to be interventions that look at how these experiences have impacted specific groups of women, and also the intersectional nature. So sometimes it's not just because we are from a particular racial or ethnic group, it's because we are also women and girls, or maybe we are poorer women and girls who therefore are going to be more oppressed. So we have to take what's called an intersectional perspective, ensure that women's voices are at the center, and so that women are raising these issues in terms of the kind of changes, policy and other interventions, programmatic interventions that we need to see. And to help this along, I'm actually involved with a project called the Mbuya Nahanda African Women and Reparations Project that is interviewing women from across the world, in the Caribbean, the wider Americas, Africa, and in Europe, to get a sense of what are the experiences of women within our African and African diaspora reparations movements. How do we kind of fare, and how many examples are there of good practice in including some of these issues? I can also say finally that in the UK process that the Stop the Maangamizi campaign is championing, which is the demand for the UK government to establish an all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice, we have ensured that we've included within the draft terms of reference a recognition of the gendered experiences of harm. Continuing harms today. So we're not just looking at women and girls, we're also looking at incidents of where there's disproportionate impacts for men and boys. But we are introducing that gendered lens so that none of us gets left behind.
Wow, that's the
Wow, Esther.
As I said earlier, Esther, I swear I do not know how you find any time to sleep. I'm sure Natasha is keen to bring it to a close, but for me, Esther, my final words is a simple solution when it comes to the Caribbean and how women can be involved. And me, more female prime ministers.
Yes, and in positions of power. Yes, Esther, thank you so much for such an elucidating conversation. Whenever we speak with you, I just feel like we could just go on and on and on and on. It's always when we're in the meat of the matter that time just, time escapes us. But thank you once again for joining us today. As Yolande mentioned earlier, if you guys missed Esther's presentation during our Leveling Up campaign in last October, you missed something. You can find it on our YouTube channel and on our audio podcast platforms as well. Don't want to miss this. This will also be there, and we will also put Esther's links to the campaign that she's involved in and everything that Esther's involved in. We'll put her information in our show notes and in our YouTube description. You can find Esther at www.stopthemaangamizi.com. We'll put the spelling here for you. If you're listening, check our show notes, you'll find the spelling. And you can also email her at stopthemaangamizi@gmail.com. Esther, thank you so much for your presence and for your knowledge that you share with us. And it's a wrap for us today on our Mute Now podcast. Yolande, take us away with the social media podcast platforms. If you need some help, just tag me in.
You're being funny. Usually I get to simply say, keep raising the volume on the whispered conversations in our community. But ladies and gentlemen, if you're here listening to us, you can find us on our usual platforms, social media handles at Unmute Now Podcast on YouTube, at Unmute Now on Facebook and Instagram, and at Unmute Now One on Twitter. And don't forget, we also have our audio podcast platforms, the usual platforms on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, and across podcast streaming platforms. I can't speak to them. It's a mouthful. Esther, I want to
We're hyped from Esther.
Thank you. It's always a
Thank
pleasure,
you.
as
Thank
Natasha
you.
said, to have you, Esther.
All right, take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye.
All right, take
And
care.
it's a bye-bye from us, everyone. Bye-bye.